Rain came down over Manhattan like the city itself was trying to wash away a sin before anyone could witness it. Outside the marble steps of the courthouse, reporters stood beneath black umbrellas, cameras flashing through the storm, hungry for the kind of scandal that could make a nobody famous and a king look human. Evelyn Carter kept her eyes lowered, her fingers cold around the bouquet she had never wanted. She was 25, a waitress from Brooklyn who smelled faintly of diner coffee, rainwater, and survival. Her dress was ivory, expensive, and chosen by someone else. The diamond ring on her hand felt less like a promise and more like a lock. Beside her stood Adrian Moretti, the cold ruler of the Moretti Syndicate, a man whose name turned rooms quiet before he even entered them. At 34, Adrian carried power without needing to display it. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes calm in a way that felt more dangerous than anger. Around them waited armored SUVs, silent drivers, black umbrellas, and men with hard faces who watched every window, every passing car, every breath Evelyn took. To the cameras, it looked like a dark fairy tale. A ruthless Mafia king had married a broken waitress. To Evelyn, it felt like stepping into a beautiful cage. No one knew she had spent the last 8 months hiding from Lucas Grayson, the man who used love like a leash and fear like a weapon. Lucas had ties to underground gambling syndicates, dirty money, and men who smiled while ruining lives. Evelyn had escaped him with one bag, $200, and a heart trained to beat quietly. She had rebuilt herself in pieces, taking double shifts at a Brooklyn diner, sleeping with a chair against her apartment door, flinching whenever footsteps slowed outside her hallway. Then Adrian Moretti found her, offered marriage without warmth, protection without explanation, and a future that sounded safer than freedom. The ceremony had taken 14 minutes. Adrian never kissed her with affection. He only placed his hand at the small of her back when the crowd surged too close, and every man near them moved away as if warned by an invisible blade. Evelyn hated that part of her noticed. He was cruel in his silence, controlling in his calm, but no one touched her. No one shouted near her. No one dared step into her space without his eyes turning lethal. She was imprisoned, but protected. Terrified, but somehow safer than she had been in years. The world whispered that Adrian had married her out of obsession. Some said he saw her serving coffee one night and decided she belonged to him. Others claimed she had stolen the attention of a monster and would pay for it forever. None of them knew the truth. Evelyn did not know it either. Adrian had not chosen her for love. He had chosen her because her name, her past, and her connection to Lucas Grayson were keys to destroying the rival family that had once tried to bury the Moretti empire. She was not a bride. She was a move on a chessboard. When the Rolls-Royce carried them away from the courthouse, Evelyn watched Manhattan blur behind rain-streaked glass. Adrian sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the controlled warmth of him, distant enough to remind her she meant nothing. His voice came low, almost a whisper, without looking at her. He told her she would live in his penthouse, follow his security rules, and never leave without guards. He did not ask if she understood. Men like Adrian did not ask. They commanded, and the world rearranged itself. The penthouse waited above the skyline like a private kingdom of glass, steel, and silence. Armed elevators opened into marble floors, private chefs moved like ghosts, and staff lowered their eyes before speaking. Evelyn stood in the center of all that luxury, feeling smaller than she ever had in her worn Brooklyn apartment. Adrian watched her from across the room. She did not beg. She did not question him. She did not cry. That silence disturbed him more than panic would have. Later, when one of his men raised his voice in the hallway, Evelyn's body reacted before her mind could stop it. Her shoulders tightened, her breath caught, and her hand lifted toward her face as if protecting herself from a memory. Adrian saw it. Something cold shifted behind his eyes. For the first time that day, the marriage stopped feeling like revenge. Someone had damaged Evelyn Carter long before Adrian Moretti ever touched her world, and as he watched her hide that fear behind perfect silence, indifference inside him began turning into rage. The Moretti penthouse overlooked Manhattan like a silent empire floating above the city. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected storms, helicopters, and sleepless lights stretching endlessly into the dark, yet Evelyn Carter still moved through the massive space like she was afraid of taking up too much air. The mansion staff noticed it immediately. The new Mrs. Moretti never acted like a mafia queen. She acted like a woman waiting to be punished for existing. Every morning she folded the blankets herself despite 3 housekeepers assigned to the penthouse floor. She cleaned coffee cups before the staff could collect them. She apologized whenever someone opened a door for her. During meals prepared by private chefs flown in from Milan, Evelyn barely touched her food, cutting expensive steak into tiny pieces she never finished. Sometimes she slipped dinner rolls into napkins out of pure instinct, a habit born from years of uncertainty and survival. Nobody mocked her for it. They only watched quietly with the uncomfortable pity reserved for emotionally scarred people trying to hide inside routine. Adrian noticed everything. He noticed she still wore oversized sweaters from her old Brooklyn apartment despite closets filled with designer clothing worth more than most people's yearly salaries. He noticed his black cards remained untouched on the marble kitchen counter for nearly 2 weeks. He noticed she flinched whenever footsteps approached too quickly behind her. Most disturbingly, he noticed how carefully she minimized herself, as though making her existence smaller could somehow keep her safe. It unsettled him in ways violence never had. Adrian Moretti had spent his life surrounded by fear. Men trembled when he entered rooms. Politicians lowered their voices around him. Rival syndicates whispered his name like a warning passed through dark alleyways. Fear was power. Fear was control. But Evelyn's fear was different. It wasn't strategic. It lived deep beneath her skin, stitched into her breathing, her posture, the way she instinctively moved toward walls instead of open spaces. She carried terror quietly, and somehow that silence began destroying his concentration more effectively than any enemy ever could. At night, when insomnia tightened around his chest like old chains, Adrian found himself watching security footage from the penthouse instead of reviewing syndicate operations. The cameras showed Evelyn wandering barefoot into the kitchen at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep. Sometimes she sat curled near the massive windows, staring down at the city while rain crawled against the glass. Other nights he watched her wake from nightmares, gasping softly, immediately covering her mouth afterward as if even fear itself needed permission to exist. One recording disturbed him more than the others. Evelyn had locked herself inside the marble bathroom during a panic attack. She sat on the cold floor gripping the sink cabinet while trying desperately to silence her breathing. No screaming. No crying loudly. Just controlled terror hidden behind shaking hands. Adrian watched the footage twice, then shut the screen off harder than intended. For reasons he refused to examine too closely, rage coiled slowly beneath his ribs. This marriage was supposed to be revenge. Lucas Grayson's connections to rival gambling syndicates made Evelyn useful. Adrian had chosen her because rival families would see her disappearance as weakness, instability, betrayal. She was a calculated move meant to fracture alliances during an underground financial war already boiling beneath New York's luxury skyline. None of this was supposed to become personal. But Evelyn's silence was becoming personal. Adrian himself had been raised inside violence polished to look like power. His mother had died during a syndicate war when he was 13. Since then, emotions became liabilities, trust became dangerous, and survival depended entirely on control. For years he had perfected emotional numbness until it felt permanent. Yet now he found himself replacing staff members simply because they made Evelyn nervous. He doubled penthouse security after noticing her checking door locks repeatedly before bed. Without telling her, he assigned female guards outside her favorite cafe because he learned she relaxed slightly around women. The shift frightened even him. One evening, during a formal dinner attended by syndicate executives, Evelyn accidentally dropped a crystal water glass beside the table. The sound shattered through the dining room like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped instantly. The air itself seemed to freeze. Evelyn's face lost all color. "I'm sorry," she whispered immediately, stepping backward so quickly her chair nearly tipped over. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean it. Please, I didn't mean." The panic in her voice disturbed the entire room. Nobody moved. Adrian slowly stood from the head of the table. His men expected fury. Fear tightened across the dining room because Adrian Moretti was not known for patience. Instead, without saying a word, he crouched beside the broken glass himself. The king of the Moretti Empire calmly gathered shattered crystal with his bare hands while Evelyn stared at him in complete confusion. Around the table, hardened syndicate members exchanged stunned glances. Their cold boss never cleaned up after anyone. He barely acknowledged weakness, let alone protected it. But Adrian only looked up at Evelyn once and said quietly, "You don't need to apologize for accidents here." The words hit her harder than shouting ever could. Later that night, unable to sleep again, Adrian reviewed security footage one final time before dawn. Evelyn had fallen asleep on the far edge of their enormous bed, curled tightly beneath one thin blanket despite the cold. Her sweater sleeve had shifted upward slightly during sleep. And there, hidden beneath soft skin, Adrian saw fresh bruises lining her wrist. Bruises he never caused. The room around him went completely silent as something dark and lethal awakened inside his chest. The motel windows exploded inward seconds after Adrian confessed the truth hiding beneath his cold empire. Neon lights shattered across the wet pavement outside while gunfire ripped through the darkness beyond the parking lot. Evelyn's breath caught violently as Adrian grabbed her instantly, pulling her against his chest before the second wave destroyed the flickering sign outside the room. Red smoke and sparks swallowed the hallway beyond the broken door, turning the entire motel into chaos soaked in rain and fear. "Stay close to me," Adrian said quietly. Not commanding. Terrified. That difference changed something inside Evelyn immediately. The king of the Moretti Empire moved through the smoke with terrifying control, shielding her body with his own while tactical boots thundered through the stairwells below. Somewhere outside, armored SUVs screeched across soaked asphalt while encrypted radios crackled between Moretti soldiers flooding the motel perimeter. Rival syndicates had not simply sent assassins. They had declared war openly. And Adrian Moretti answered war personally. The hallway lights flickered violently as smoke thickened around them. Evelyn's heart pounded hard enough to hurt while Adrian guided her down the emergency stairwell with one hand firmly around her waist. Every movement felt calculated. Protective. Possessive. Mine. The terrifying thing was no longer the danger surrounding them. It was how safe she felt inside it. Halfway down the stairwell, another burst of gunfire echoed upward. Adrian immediately turned, pulling Evelyn behind him as bullets tore through the metal railing beside his shoulder. The impact slammed him backward slightly, but he never let go of her. Evelyn stared in horror at the dark stain spreading slowly beneath his black shirt. He had been hit protecting her. Something inside her cracked emotionally at that moment. Not fear. Something deeper. Adrian barely reacted to the injury. He continued moving with cold precision, forcing open the lower exit door while smoke curled through the stairwell like ghosts hunting them downward. Outside, shattered neon reflected across rain-soaked concrete beside black bulletproof SUVs lined aggressively around the motel entrance. Moretti soldiers surrounded the property with military discipline, their loyalty absolute despite the chaos erupting around them. Evelyn watched Adrian give commands calmly while blood slowly soaked through his sleeve. The contradiction destroyed her emotionally. This man terrified entire syndicates. Politicians feared his empire. Rival kings vanished because of whispers attached to his name. Yet Adrian stood bleeding in the rain, caring only whether she remained safe. One assassin appeared briefly near the parking structure entrance. Adrian reacted instantly, moving Evelyn behind the SUV door before handling the threat with cold, terrifying precision. No rage. No screaming. Just lethal control sharpened by years of surviving underground wars. Evelyn finally understood the truth she had avoided for weeks. Adrian Moretti would burn entire cities before allowing someone to take her. The realization should have frightened her more. Instead, it made her chest ache. Hours later, long after Manhattan disappeared behind snow-covered mountain roads, the private jet carrying them landed near a remote estate hidden deep within the Colorado mountains. Blizzard winds swallowed the world outside while the Moretti safe house stood isolated beneath endless snow and towering pine forests. The estate looked less like a mansion and more like a fortress built for kings hiding from war. Inside, silence replaced chaos. For the first time in days, nobody shouted through radios. No gunfire echoed nearby. Only firelight flickered across massive stone walls while snow pressed softly against the windows outside. Adrian collapsed shortly after entering the estate. The adrenaline keeping him upright finally broke beneath blood loss and exhaustion. Evelyn caught him before he hit the marble floor completely, panic flooding her chest as guards rushed forward. But Adrian refused anyone touching him except her. That choice stunned the entire room. Hours later, Evelyn sat beside him inside the quiet master suite while snowstorms buried the mountains outside. She carefully cleaned the wound near his shoulder with trembling hands, her oversized sweater sleeves pushed upward while warm firelight softened the sharp edges of the dangerous room around them. The symbolism settled silently between them. A broken waitress nursing a wounded king. Adrian remained unusually quiet throughout the night. Exhaustion stripped away parts of his emotional armor, revealing fragments of the man hidden beneath the empire. Around midnight, he finally admitted why loss haunted him so violently. His mother died during a syndicate betrayal when he was 13. Since then, everyone Adrian protected eventually disappeared. The confession came softly, almost embarrassed by its own existence. Evelyn listened without interrupting while storm winds whispered against the glass beyond them. For the first time, she understood the loneliness beneath Adrian's control. The fear. The constant pressure of power crushing him silently from within. Without thinking, Evelyn touched the scar near his ribs gently. Adrian froze. No woman had touched him with tenderness in years. Not fear. Not manipulation. Not desire for power. Just quiet affection. The reaction nearly destroyed him emotionally. His breathing slowed while Evelyn's fingers traced another scar across his shoulder. The dangerous king who commanded empires suddenly looked devastatingly human beneath her touch. That night, after Adrian finally fell asleep beside the fire, Evelyn wandered quietly through the office connected to the mountain suite searching for medical supplies. Instead, she found documents spread across the mahogany desk. Old surveillance files. Her name, Lucas Grayson. Rival syndicate reports. And one sentence that made her blood run cold. Marriage acquisition approved for strategic revenge operation against Grayson Network. Evelyn stared at the papers while snowstorms raged outside the mountain estate. The entire marriage had begun as revenge. Snow continued falling outside the Colorado estate like the mountains themselves were trying to bury the truth before sunrise exposed it completely. Evelyn stood motionless inside Adrian's private office while firelight flickered across the documents, trembling softly in her hands. The words blurred together after a while, but their meaning remained devastatingly clear. Surveillance reports. Syndicate strategy notes. Psychological assessments connected to Lucas Grayson's network. And in the center of everything sat her name like a transaction written into war. Not love. Not fate. A calculated revenge operation. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, harder to breathe inside. Evelyn's chest tightened while old trauma surfaced violently beneath her skin. Lucas once convinced her every relationship carried hidden motives. Every act of kindness eventually demanded payment. Adrian had spent months quietly dismantling those fears through protection, silence, loyalty, and emotional safety. Yet now those same fears returned stronger than before because this betrayal cut deeper than Lucas ever had. Adrian had made her feel safe. That was what destroyed her most. The dangerous king who slept outside her bedroom door, who bled protecting her inside smoke-filled hallways, who watched her nightmares without judgment, had originally chosen her as part of a syndicate war. Evelyn stared at the files while her heartbeat pounded unevenly against her ribs. She no longer knew which memories were real and which were strategy. When Adrian entered the office minutes later, exhaustion disappeared instantly from his face the second he saw the documents in her hands. Silence swallowed the room. No empire could protect him from this moment. Evelyn looked at him differently now. Not fearful. Worse. Emotionally distant. The kind of distance trauma survivors create when their trust finally collapses beneath betrayal. Adrian stepped toward her carefully, but she instinctively moved back, clutching the files tighter against herself like armor. The movement nearly destroyed him. It started that way, Adrian admitted quietly after a long, painful silence. The revenge did. His honesty made the room hurt even more. Evelyn lowered her gaze because hearing truth from him somehow felt crueler than lies. Adrian tried explaining everything after that. Lucas Grayson's connection to rival syndicates. The manipulation strategy. The pressure from underground alliances threatening his empire. He admitted she was originally supposed to become leverage against powerful enemies during a silent financial war spreading beneath New York. But somewhere along the way, she became something else. Something dangerous to him personally. You changed everything, Adrian said softly, voice rough beneath exhaustion. I stopped seeing the plan. I only saw you. Evelyn wanted to believe him. That was the tragedy. Part of her still did. But emotionally scarred people survive through control, and trust felt too dangerous now. Her mind replayed every moment differently. The courthouse wedding. The protection. The obsession. Had any of it belonged to her? Or was she simply another strategic move executed perfectly by a king controlling his empire? Her silence afterward became unbearable. Adrian would have preferred screaming. Anger. Hatred. Anything except the quiet emptiness settling inside her eyes. Over the next 2 days inside the mountain estate, Evelyn barely spoke. She moved through rooms like a ghost, emotionally retreating deeper into herself while Adrian watched helplessly from a distance. For the first time in years, Adrian Moretti understood fear. Not fear of enemies. Fear of losing the only person who ever made his violent world feel human. On the third morning, Evelyn left the estate before sunrise. No dramatic goodbye. No accusations. Only a handwritten note resting beside untouched coffee. I finally felt safe with you. That's why this hurts. Adrian stared at the note for nearly an hour without moving. Then something inside him went cold permanently. Back in Manhattan, the Empire noticed immediately. Adrian became even more ruthless than before, but now the violence carried no purpose beyond emotional emptiness. Rival syndicates lost millions overnight. Political alliances collapsed under Moretti pressure. Entire underground operations vanished silently beneath financial ruin and strategic destruction. The King of New York won every war placed before him. And still looked haunted. The penthouse grew quieter each month. Adrian stopped attending elite gatherings unless necessary. He rarely slept. Security footage of Evelyn disappeared from his office because he could no longer survive hearing her voice. Even his closest men avoided discussing her name because the silence afterward felt unbearable. Meanwhile, Evelyn rebuilt herself alone once again. She rented a small apartment near Boston under another fake identity, far away from syndicates, empire politics, and memories that still woke her breathless at night. Weeks turned into months. Winter faded slowly into spring. Then one rainy morning inside a private clinic, Evelyn discovered the truth that changed everything again. She was pregnant. The realization terrified her more than syndicate wars ever had. For days she sat awake beside apartment windows debating whether Adrian deserved to know. Part of her still remembered the warmth in his eyes during vulnerable moments hidden beneath all that dangerous control. Another part remembered the files. The manipulation. The betrayal woven into the foundation of their marriage. Fear consumed her emotionally. What if their child inherited a life shaped by power, violence, and emotional ruin? What if Adrian became possessive instead of loving? What if she repeated every toxic cycle she spent years trying to escape? Months passed before fate destroyed her hiding place completely. One stormy evening in Manhattan, Evelyn stepped out of a pharmacy holding ultrasound documents tightly against her chest while rain soaked the city streets around her. And directly across the road, beside a black armored SUV beneath glowing traffic lights, Adrian Moretti looked up and saw her. Then his eyes dropped slowly to the visible curve of her stomach. The king of the Moretti Empire stopped breathing. Snow began falling over Manhattan the night Adrian Moretti saw Evelyn again. She stood outside the hospital entrance beneath a weak yellow light, one hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach, the other gripping medical papers against her chest. For one frozen second, the city noise disappeared. Adrian saw no empire, no enemies, no war waiting in the dark. He saw only the woman he had lost, carrying a life he had never known existed. He did not approach like a king. He did not command, question, or accuse. He simply followed from a distance, careful enough not to frighten her, broken enough not to trust himself near her. Evelyn noticed the black SUV 2 blocks later, but it never came too close. That restraint unsettled her more than control ever had. Adrian Moretti, the man who once bent New York to his will, was choosing patience. In the following weeks, protection appeared around Evelyn without demands attached. Her medical bills were quietly handled. The old apartment building she feared entering after dark suddenly received new locks, better lighting, and private security under another company's name. A female doctor with discreet Moretti loyalty began checking on her health. Evelyn understood who was behind it, Yet Adrian never used the child to force himself back into her life. That was when she began noticing the change. He looked softer when she saw him from across streets, colder only toward the world that threatened her. His power was still there, but the control had changed shape. It no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a shield waiting outside the door, silent enough to let her breathe. For the first time, Evelyn realized she was not the same broken waitress who had stood trembling at that courthouse. She was becoming a mother. She was becoming powerful. She was becoming someone who could choose. Then the final war came. Rival syndicates learned about the pregnancy and saw weakness where Adrian saw family. One storm-covered night, men loyal to the Grayson network moved toward Evelyn's apartment, planning to take the child before it was even born. They never reached her door. Adrian's empire descended through the snow with armored SUVs, helicopters cutting through white darkness, and loyal soldiers locking down every street around her building. New York watched a silent underworld war ignite beneath falling snow. Adrian came for Evelyn himself. He found her in the stairwell, calm but pale, one hand on the railing and the other over her stomach. She expected fear to control her again, but something different rose inside her this time. She stepped toward him instead of away. Adrian's eyes softened with a devastation he no longer tried to hide. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he whispered. "I am asking for the right to protect what I should have loved honestly from the beginning." The words broke something open in her chest. Not because they were perfect, but because they were finally without power. No possession. No manipulation. No empire speaking through him. Just a man stripped down to remorse, love, and fear. Evelyn cried then, openly, painfully, for every night she had survived alone and every safe place she had been too afraid to trust. Adrian held her carefully, like touching her too tightly might shatter the fragile peace between them. She admitted the truth against his chest with a shaking breath. She had tried to run from him, from the war, from the baby's future, but the only place her heart had ever felt truly safe was near him. Weeks later, their child was born during a quiet winter sunrise. Adrian held the newborn with trembling hands, completely undone by something so small and innocent trusting him without fear. Evelyn watched him from the hospital bed, exhausted and peaceful, seeing not the monster the world feared but the man love had finally humbled. By spring, the guarded penthouse no longer felt like a prison. It became a sanctuary. Evelyn slept against Adrian's chest while their newborn rested nearby, safe behind glass, steel, loyalty, and the dangerous heart of a man remade by love. Across New York, enemies still whispered Adrian Moretti's name in fear, but inside that quiet penthouse, the cold Mafia king feared only one thing now: losing the woman whose silence had once destroyed him.